January 17, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind carries sand like fine ash across the rocky plateau. In the pre-dawn cold, a German panzer commander stands in the cupola of his Tiger Eye, binoculars pressed against wind-burned eyes. Through the amber haze of first light, he watches American tanks crawl into the valley below, 37 M4 Shermans, their olive-drab hulls still factory-fresh, their crews still learning the rhythm of war. The German officer lowers his binoculars and permits himself a thin smile. He has read the intelligence reports. He knows the specifications by heart. The Sherman, 30 tons, 75mm gun, armored barely 2 inches thick at the glassy plate. His Tiger weighs 56 tons. Its 88mm cannon can punch through 4 inches of steel at 2,000 meters. The mathematics of destruction, he thinks, favor the Reich. He does not yet understand that he is watching the opening act of an industrial drama that will redefine the meaning of military power. He does not know that the clumsy tanks below him represent not German superiority, but American inevitability. What unfolds at Kasserine Pass in the winter of 1943 is not merely a tactical defeat for inexperienced American forces. It is the moment when German confidence in armored warfare meets the grinding reality of democratic production. The Sherman tank, dismissed by Wehrmacht commanders as mechanically inferior and tactically inadequate, will become the instrument of an industrial miracle so vast, so relentless, that it drowns the technical excellence of German engineering beneath a tide of American steel. The story of the Sherman is not a story of battlefield supremacy. It is a story of factories that never sleep, of assembly lines that stretch for city blocks, of a nation that transformed its peacetime economy into a war machine of unprecedented scale in less than 2 years. While German engineers refined their panzers into instruments of tactical perfection, American factories did something the German High Command considered impossible. They built an army of tanks so numerous that individual quality became strategically irrelevant. 50,000 M4 Shermans rolled off American assembly lines between 1942 and 1945, more tanks than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union produced combined during the same period. This is the story of how industrial capacity defeated tactical brilliance, how abundance overwhelmed expertise, and how a democracy at war proved capable of material mobilization on a scale that authoritarian regimes could neither match nor comprehend. In the winter of 1940, the German Wehrmacht stood as the most formidable military force on earth. Their panzer divisions had torn through Poland in weeks, shattered French defenses in days, and demonstrated a new form of warfare that combined speed, armor, and concentrated firepower into an unstoppable offensive doctrine. At the heart of this success stood the German Tank Corps, mechanically sophisticated, tactically innovative, crewed by men who had trained for years in the art of armored warfare. The Panzer III and Panzer IV represented the cutting edge of military technology, well-armored, powerfully armed, supported by a doctrine that emphasized maneuver and shock. When German intelligence officers examined captured Soviet T-34s in 1941, they understood immediately that they faced a technical challenge. When they examined early model American tanks in 1942, they saw only confirmation of their existing assumptions about democratic incompetence. The American M3 Lee, rushed into production in 1941, embodied every stereotype German commanders held about American military design. It was tall, awkward, mounting its primary gun in a side sponson that required the entire tank to turn to engage targets. It was mechanically complex, prone to breakdowns, unsuited to the intimate violence of tank versus tank combat. German after-action reports from North Africa in 1942 described American armor with barely concealed contempt. One Panzer Regiment commander wrote that engaging American tanks was less combat than target practice. Another noted that the American tankers fight bravely, but their machines are inferior in every measurable category. This assessment was not entirely wrong. The early American tanks were inferior. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that American tank design in 1942 represented not the limit of American capability, but merely the first iteration of an industrial system still gearing up to full production. The M4 Sherman, which began rolling off assembly lines in February 1942, was never intended to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be good enough, mobile enough, reliable enough, numerous enough, to win a war of attrition against an enemy whose factories could not match American production rates. The Sherman weighed 30 tons, mounted a 75mm gun, could travel at 25 miles per hour on roads, and required a crew of 5. Its armor was adequate against most German tank guns at medium range. Its main gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV under ideal conditions. By every technical metric that mattered to German engineers, armor thickness, gun penetration, mechanical complexity, the Sherman was unremarkable. What made it revolutionary was not its design, but the speed and scale at which American industry could produce it. The first production Sherman emerged from the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio on February 10, 1942, less than 10 weeks after the United States entered the war. By April, 11 separate factories across the American industrial heartland were producing Shermans. By June, production had reached 300 tanks per month. By December 1942, American factories were completing over 1,000 Shermans every 30 days, more than Germany produced in total armored vehicles of all types during the same period. The German High Command watched these production figures with growing unease, but they consoled themselves with the assumption that quantity could not overcome quality, that a well-trained German panzer crew in a technically superior Tiger or Panther could defeat multiple Shermans through superior tactics and firepower. This assumption was not entirely incorrect. A single Tiger I, with its 88mm gun and thick frontal armor, could and often did destroy multiple Shermans in a single engagement. What the Germans failed to calculate was that America could afford to lose 5 Shermans for every Tiger destroyed and still have more tanks in reserve than Germany could field in total. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, fought across frozen Tunisian valleys in February 1943, seemed to confirm German assumptions about Sherman inadequacy. The American II Corps, newly arrived in North Africa and still learning the brutal calculus of armored warfare, lost 183 tanks in 4 days of fighting against experienced panzer units equipped with Tigers and Panzer IVs. German commanders wrote confidently in their after-action reports that American armor posed no serious threat to Wehrmacht tank superiority. One regimental commander noted with satisfaction that the American Sherman burns easily when struck, and its crews lack the tactical sophistication to exploit even their numerical advantages. What these reports failed to mention, what the German commanders perhaps could not yet perceive, was that every American tank destroyed at Kasserine was replaced within weeks by 3 more fresh from Detroit. Every American crew killed in the Tunisian hills was replaced by new crews trained at Fort Knox, Fort Benning, and a dozen other stateside facilities that processed thousands of tankers every month. The Wehrmacht was fighting a war of tactical excellence. America was fighting a war of industrial replacement. By the summer of 1943, the mathematics of armor production had begun to overwhelm German tactical advantages. The invasion of Sicily in July saw 500 American tanks come ashore in the first wave, more armor than the entire German defense force on the island possessed. When those tanks were damaged or destroyed, they were replaced from vast stocks accumulated in North African depots. German defenders, fighting with skill and courage, destroyed or disabled dozens of American tanks, only to watch new ones appear the following day, the day after that, in numbers that made tactical victories strategically meaningless. A German tank battalion commander captured during the Sicily campaign told his interrogators that, "You can destroy 10 American tanks and they send 20 more. You destroy those and they send 30. It is not warfare, it is industrial exhaustion." He had grasped, perhaps more clearly than his superiors in Berlin, the essential truth of the Sherman's role in American military strategy. The Sherman was not designed to win tank duels. It was designed to be everywhere, always, in numbers that made German resistance mathematically impossible. The invasion of Italy in September 1943 accelerated this pattern. American tank units pushed up the Italian peninsula supported by production systems that delivered replacement vehicles faster than the Germans could destroy them. When the Fifth Army fought for Monte Cassino in the winter of 1944, American tank companies absorbed catastrophic losses, entire platoons destroyed in single engagements, and returned to full strength within days. German defenders, fighting from prepared positions with superior tactics and better individual weapons, found themselves overwhelmed not by American skill but by American persistence. One captured German officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, told his captors that fighting the Americans is like fighting the ocean. You can hold back one wave, but there is always another wave behind it, and another behind that, until you are simply drowned. This was the Sherman's true purpose, to be the wave that never stopped coming. The technical limitations of the Sherman, its relatively thin armor, its inadequate main gun, its tendency to catch fire when penetrated, became legendary among American tank crews. They called it the Ronson, because it lit on fire as easily as the Ronson lighter, whose advertising slogan promised it. Lights every time. They called it the Tommy Cooker, after the British term for a portable stove. Survival rates for Sherman crews in combat against German Tigers or Panthers were grim. Analysis of tank battles in Normandy in 1944 showed that a Sherman had roughly a 1 in 5 chance of surviving a direct confrontation with a Panther, a 1 in 7 chance against a Tiger. American tankers understood these odds with bitter clarity. They also understood something their German counterparts did not, that every Sherman destroyed was a statistical abstraction to American logistics, while every Tiger lost was an irreplaceable blow to German combat power. The fundamental asymmetry of the tank war in Europe after 1943 was this: Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,400 Tiger tanks between 1942 and 1945, formidable weapons, tactically superior to the Sherman in nearly every measurable way. America produced 49,234 M4 Shermans in the same period. Even accounting for the Sherman's tactical inferiority, the mathematics were overwhelming. If every German Tiger destroyed 7 Shermans before being knocked out, a generous estimate, the Germans would run out of Tigers long before America ran out of Shermans. And behind those Shermans stood American factories capable of producing more tanks in a month than Germany produced in a year. The German response to Sherman production figures reveals the cognitive dissonance at the heart of Wehrmacht strategic thinking. Intelligence reports throughout 1943 and 1944 documented American production numbers with increasing alarm. German generals read these figures, confirmed them through multiple sources, and then proceeded to plan operations as if American industrial capacity could be overcome through tactical brilliance and superior German engineering. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood the implications more clearly than most German military leaders. In a meeting with Hitler in January 1944, Speer presented production figures showing that American tank output exceeded combined German production of all armored vehicles by a factor of 5 to 1. He argued that Germany could not win a war of attrition against American industrial capacity, that every tank battle Germany won tactically represented a strategic defeat if American losses were replaced faster than German ones. Hitler dismissed Speer's concerns, arguing that German tactical superiority and the fighting quality of German soldiers would overcome American material advantages. This was not mere propaganda. Hitler and much of the German high command genuinely believed that the superior quality of German weapons and German training could compensate for overwhelming American numerical superiority. They were fighting the war they wanted to fight, not the war they actually faced. The German tank commanders who actually engaged American Shermans in combat developed a more nuanced understanding. They respected the Sherman's reliability, its mechanical simplicity that allowed American crews to keep tanks running under field conditions that would have sidelined more complex German vehicles. They noted the Sherman's excellent gun stabilization system, which allowed it to fire accurately on the move, a capability German tanks lacked. They acknowledged the Sherman's superior logistics, the vast supply network that kept American tanks fueled, armed, and maintained even in the chaos of rapid advances. But they continued to believe that these advantages could be overcome through superior tactics and better individual weapons. A panzer company commander captured after the Battle of the Bulge told interrogators that The American tanker relies on his machine and his supplies. The German tanker relies on his skill and his courage. In a fair fight, we win every time. He failed to understand that America had no intention of fighting fair. America intended to fight with 5 tanks for every German one, 10 replacement crews for every experienced German crew, supply lines so vast that mechanical failures became tactical inconveniences rather than strategic problems. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 demonstrated the full maturity of American tank production. The Allies landed approximately 2,000 tanks in the first week of the invasion, more armor than the entire German 7th Army possessed in northern France. When German panzer divisions launched counterattacks designed to drive the invaders back into the sea, they discovered that destroying American tanks accomplished nothing. Every Sherman knocked out was replaced within days. Every American tank company decimated in the hedgerows was back to full strength before the German units that destroyed them could reorganize and rearm. The bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, favored German defenders and turned tank combat into close-range ambushes that maximized the Sherman's vulnerabilities. American tank losses in Normandy were catastrophic, over 2,000 Shermans destroyed or disabled in the first 2 months of fighting. And yet by August 1944, American armored strength in France had increased, not decreased. The Germans were winning tactical victories while losing the strategic war. The symbolic power of the Sherman, for both American crews and German defenders, transcended its technical specifications. For American tankers, the Sherman represented the industrial might of a nation that could replace any loss, supply any need, overcome any obstacle through sheer material abundance. Crews painted names on their tanks. Fury Easy 8. Cobra, personalizing machines that were fundamentally interchangeable. They knew that if their Sherman was destroyed, they would likely receive an identical replacement within days, that the war machine supporting them was vast beyond German comprehension. For German defenders, the endless waves of Shermans came to represent something more psychologically devastating than tactical defeat. They represented the futility of resistance against an enemy that could absorb any loss and return stronger. A German infantryman captured during the Battle of the Bulge described watching American tank columns pass through his position. They came in rows, 50 tanks, 100 tanks, and we knew that even if we destroyed half of them, more would come tomorrow, and more the day after. It was not fighting. It was mathematics. The final German offensive of the war in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, represented both the apex and the collapse of German armor doctrine. The Wehrmacht committed its last significant reserves of tanks and trained crews to an operation designed to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. In the first days of the offensive, German forces achieved tactical surprise and local superiority, destroying or capturing hundreds of American tanks. Once again, German commanders believed that tactical excellence could overcome strategic reality. Once again, they were wrong. Within 10 days, American reinforcements had arrived from across France. Entire tank divisions re-equipped with fresh Shermans pulled from depots that held thousands of reserve vehicles. The Germans, fighting with every tank they possessed, discovered that destroying American armor accomplished nothing because American armor was functionally infinite. By January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed not because German tanks were destroyed, though many were, but because German units ran out of fuel, ammunition, and replacement crews while American units simply called for more supplies and more tanks and kept advancing. The production systems that built the Sherman represented a transformation of American industry as profound as the tanks themselves. The 11 primary Sherman production facilities stretched from coast to coast: Lima Locomotive in Ohio, Fisher Body in Michigan, Chrysler's Detroit Tank Arsenal, Ford's massive River Rouge Complex, Press Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, and 5 others, each capable of producing hundreds of tanks per month. These factories operated around the clock, 7 days a week, employing workers who had never built military equipment before, women who had worked in textile mills, men who had assembled automobiles, teenagers straight out of high school. The Sherman was designed for this workforce. Its mechanical systems were simplified compared to German tanks specifically to allow rapid production by semi-skilled workers. Its parts were standardized and interchangeable, allowing any Sherman to be repaired using components from any other Sherman. Its assembly process was broken down into discrete tasks that could be learned in weeks rather than the months required to train German tank builders. The Fisher Body Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, exemplified this industrial transformation. Built in 1942 on empty farmland, the plant covered 113 acres under a single roof. At peak production in 1943, the Grand Blanc plant completed one Sherman every hour, 24 hours per day. Workers assembled hulls while turrets were fabricated at a separate Fisher facility in Cleveland, then shipped to Michigan for final assembly. The entire process, from raw steel to completed tank ready for rail transport, took 48 hours. German factories, building the technically superior Panther, required an average of 7 days to complete a single tank using skilled craftsmen and precision manufacturing. The Panther was arguably the finest medium tank of the war, better armed, better armored, more sophisticated than the Sherman in every way. Germany built 6,000 Panthers between 1943 and 1945. America built 24,000 Shermans in 1943 alone. The logistics of Sherman production extended far beyond the assembly plants. Each tank required specialized components manufactured at hundreds of subcontractor facilities. Engines from Continental Motors, transmissions from Ford and Alice Chalmers, guns forged at WWII Arsenal, ammunition from plants across the industrial Midwest. The complete supply chain involved over 1,500 separate suppliers coordinated through the Army Ordnance Department in a logistics operation of staggering complexity. Raw materials, steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, flowed from mines and mills to processing plants to subcontractors to final assembly facilities in a continuous stream that moved 60 million tons of material across the American rail network every month. The Sherman became not just a weapon but a symbol of American industrial organization, proof that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources on a scale that centrally planned economies could not match. By early 1945, the collapse of German resistance in the West was not a military defeat, but an industrial surrender. German tank units, still fighting with skill and courage, found themselves facing American armored divisions that could replace losses faster than German units could inflict them. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 saw American tank columns advance into Germany, supported by supply lines that stretched back through France to the factories of Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh. German defenders, fighting now on their own territory, destroyed hundreds of American tanks in desperate last stands. And still the Shermans came, wave after wave, supported by an industrial base that was producing more tanks in April 1945 than Germany had built in the entire year. The symbolic moment of German defeat came not in a climactic tank battle but in the gradual recognition, spreading through German lines like a virus, that resistance was mathematically pointless. You could destroy the tanks in front of you, and more would arrive tomorrow. You could fight brilliantly, courageously, and still lose because the enemy's capacity to replace losses exceeded your capacity to inflict them. The American soldiers who crewed these tanks understood, with varying degrees of clarity, that they were part of something larger than individual combat. They were the human component of an industrial system that had transformed American society in less than 4 years. The factories that built Shermans had been building automobiles in 1940. The women welding tank hulls in Michigan had been sewing clothes in 1941. The supply sergeants tracking thousands of tanks across Europe had been clerks and shopkeepers before the war. The entire apparatus of American tank production represented an improvisation, a massive collective effort that succeeded not because it was elegant or efficient, but because it was vast enough to absorb every mistake and overcome every obstacle through sheer material abundance. The Sherman was not a brilliant weapon. It was a sufficient weapon produced in brilliant quantities. The final accounting of Sherman production reveals the scale of American industrial mobilization: 49,234 M4 Shermans produced between 1942 and 1945, plus thousands of specialized variants built on the same chassis, tank destroyers, recovery vehicles, engineering tanks, armored personnel carriers. At peak production in March 1944, American factories completed 2,181 Shermans in 31 days, more tanks than Germany produced in total of all types during the same month. The average cost per Sherman, $44,500, expensive by the standards of 1944, but dramatically less than the $83,000 required to build a single German Panther. The United States spent approximately $2 billion producing Shermans between 1942 and 1945. Germany spent nearly 6 billion Reichsmarks producing far fewer tanks. America won the armor war not because its tanks were better, but because its economy could sustain production on a scale that made German resistance strategically meaningless. In the end, the story of the Sherman is not primarily a story of tanks at all. It is a story of how democratic societies mobilize for total war, how free markets and distributed production networks can outproduce centrally planned economies, how abundance defeats scarcity regardless of individual quality. The German panzer commanders who dismissed the Sherman as inferior were correct in their tactical assessment. They failed to understand that modern industrial warfare is not decided by tactical engagements but by strategic endurance, that the side which can replace losses fastest wins regardless of who wins individual battles. The Sherman represented American industrial philosophy in steel form: build something good enough, build it in vast quantities, build the infrastructure to keep building it forever, and overwhelm the enemy through sheer material persistence. The 50,000th Sherman rolled off an assembly line in Detroit in January 1945, painted olive drab, mechanically identical to the first Sherman completed in February 1942. Between those two tanks lay 3 years, 11 factories, 1,500 supplier companies, hundreds of thousands of workers, and a transformation of American industrial capacity so profound that the nation emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic power. The Sherman was the instrument of that transformation and its symbol. Every time a German panzer commander destroyed a Sherman only to watch 2 more appear in its place, he was witnessing not American tactical incompetence but American strategic genius. The understanding that wars are won not by building the best weapons, but by building enough weapons to make resistance mathematically impossible. In the spring of 1945, as American tank columns rolled through collapsing German defenses, soldiers found abandoned German Tigers and Panthers by the roadsides, immobilized by lack of fuel, lack of parts, lack of trained crews to operate them. These tanks were technically superior to the Shermans that passed them by. They represented the pinnacle of German engineering, sophisticated weapons built by skilled craftsmen using precision manufacturing. They were also strategically irrelevant, beautiful anachronisms in a war decided by factories and supply lines rather than individual combat prowess. The Sherman, clumsy and mechanical and mass-produced, proved to be the weapon that mattered because there were always more Shermans, because American factories never stopped building them, because the democratic industrial base that created them could sustain production on a scale that authoritarian regimes could neither match nor comprehend. And so the story ends not with a climactic battle but with a simple truth that echoes across decades. In modern industrial warfare, sufficient abundance defeats any amount of individual excellence. The Sherman tank, dismissed and underestimated and technically inferior, won the armor war of World War II not because it was the best tank, but because it was everywhere. Always, in numbers that made German resistance a mathematical impossibility. Behind each Sherman stood the factories of Detroit, the mills of Pittsburgh, the forges of Cleveland, an entire nation mobilized for production on a scale the world had never seen. The Germans built better tanks. America built more tanks. And in the calculus of industrial warfare, more was always enough.